Welcome to the Bonner Private Research Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Bowman. Each week, we bring you exclusive conversations with members of Bill Bonner's private research team, as well as some special guests we'll meet along the way. We're trying to connect the dots, from high finance to lowly politics, private investments to public follies, from Wall Street to Main Street, at home and on the road. We're into sound money, personal freedom, classical books, and great wines, not always in that order. So join me and the rest of the Bonner Private Research team as we pack our bags and follow the money. Unless you read deeply and in your own interest, unless you explore what is most profound in what has come before you, then you will never get down to the recesses of your own self. You will never learn what Ralph Waldo Emerson rightly called self-trust and self-reliance. So expounded the greatest reader of our modern age, the late Professor Harold Bloom. In addition to authoring such titanic works as The Anxiety of Influence, A Theory of Poetry, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, and the modestly titled The Western Canon, The Books and School of the Ages, Bloom was both a tireless champion of aesthetic merit over superficial posturing and an avid proponent of deep, solitary reading. In the so-called digital age, an age that has burdened mankind with more conveniences than he knows how to handle, such careful, contemplative reading is often the first casualty of a distracted mind. Everywhere we look, we see screens. Television screens, computer screens, tablet screens, and phone screens, now practically cyborg extensions of the human arm, and forever pinging us with messages and alerts all the day long. We are pelted with pixels at home and at the office, in restaurants and airport lounges, at the bank, in the car. Everywhere we turn, a screen is there to divert us, to capture our attention, and to consume our limited time on Earth with unending notifications and updates. But whatever happened to quiet time? What about opening an old book, settling into the reading chair, forgetting the world, and letting the imagination enter a realm all of its own? What about the self-trust and self-reliance which Emerson wrote about, the kind that begins with the life of the mind, a life that nourishes and sustains on quality literature? What about original ideas, lessons learned, standing on the shoulder of giants? These questions, and plenty more, were on my own mind when I recently caught up with my good friend Chris Mayer. As longtime listeners will know, Chris is the portfolio manager of the Woodlock House Family Capital Fund and co-founder of the firm along with Bill Bonner. In addition to being an investor, author, world traveler, and a truly original thinker in his own right, Chris is also a devoted bookworm. He reads broadly across genres and deeply, especially when it comes to what he calls the big idea guys. During our conversation, Chris references dozens of books and authors that have helped shape him as a writer and as an investor, including some names with whom he delights in disagreeing, an art quickly vanishing in contemporary public discourse. As the great American novelist Henry Miller wrote in his retrospective work, The Books in My Life, those who know how to read a man know how to read his books. One suspects here that the corollary is also true. And so with that, I'd like to invite you to join me as we take a virtual tour through the shelves of Mr. Mayer's library. In my conversation with Chris, up next. This is a great place to start the conversation, I think, because, well, first of all, there's a grand irony here because you're sitting in a very well-stocked library, and you can't see behind my computer here, but I'm sitting in an empty library. I just moved apartments this holiday season, and I've got tons of books and computer cords and things on the floor. But if it's a bit echoey, it's because my library shelves are completely empty at the moment. But I remember, I had to look this up actually, but it was 8 years ago when, speaking about giving away books, you and I were backstage on the Capital account
show down in DC with our good friend, Mr. Eric Fry. And you very kindly gifted me your Henry Miller collection, which for those people who don't read a whole lot of Henry Miller, that's a pretty good thwack of a shelf, because he was nothing if not hugely prolific.
That's right.
And you had said at that particular time that you had been reading another book whose author had counseled you not to be a slave to the bookshelf.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you recall who that was, but I'm just wondering how you go about curating, what is, just I think probably a lifelong addiction for those of us.
That's right.
Sympathize with the bibliophiles among us.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times I'll start with if books are the stuff that I keep. Sometimes there's a certain part of the library. It's kind of a working library, so there's a lot of finance, investing, economics, philosophy stuff that I dip back into again and again, and so those I tend to keep. Also, books that are hard to replace, I keep. So some of the books I have have been out of print for quite a while, and to get them again would be expensive. But yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount you don't want to get too possessive about this stuff, So a lot of the books that are still in print or easily replaced, those are the ones I tend to give away, because then I think to myself, well, if for some reason I have to have that book again, I can get it, and it's not going to cost me a fortune, and not that difficult.
Yeah.
But
and
those
so
are some.
I like the. So I'm looking behind you here. I can't quite make out the titles, but you mentioned that you have, a finance section and a work section, and you're one of the few readers that I know that's omnivorous in the way that you read both fiction and nonfiction. I don't know if you get this as well, but I meet a lot of people who are really focused on either, they only read the Western canon. It's just the classics, and that's their whole kind of thing. And they see everything else as just kind of a glorified how-to book.
Right.
And then you get the other side of readers who, they read just basically for self-improvement, to learn new things. Maybe they're historians or amateur botanists or whatever it is, but they won't touch fiction with a 10-foot pole. So how do you marry those two things? Are they all in your office or spread around the house?
Mostly in my office. There are some books around the house, actually, that I just, as a way to deal with some overflow, shove some over there. So there's another bookshelf downstairs now that you mention it, that does have some things in there. I have some Jefferson and Franklin, some of the founders, some pretty books down there that look really nice in living rooms are down there. Yeah, I do have, I read widely, but I do have my interests. I mean, so on this side over here is mostly finance and investing. And on this side here, I have philosophy, mostly Western philosophy, but I do have quite a bit of Eastern philosophy above head here. And then behind me in the middle, I have a lot of what I just kind of call idea guys. So I have like Neil Postman and Feynman and, these guys who you just, brilliant about idea. Buckminster Fuller, Alfred Korzybski, there's a bunch of those kind of guys there. And then I've got this little corner here with a lot of fiction. So I've got my Fitzgerald and Orwell, and I have my particular favorites. I've got all of P.G. Wodehouse.
Yeah, classic.
Which is there's I think it's 99 volumes there.
Isn't that? I'm reading back through some of Honoré de Balzac's catalog, and I think he may be one of the only other authors who might rival P.G. Wodehouse for just sheer output, just sheer shelf space.
Exactly. He almost has he has half the bookcases just his stuff. Right. But he lived so long. He lived to be like 93, and he wrote to the very end. So he averaged slightly better than a book a year. Because he started writing when he was very young too, when he was in his 20s. So,
I think Balzac died pretty young, actually, to make his feat even more disappointing and depressing for the rest of us.
What's so shocking about Wodehouse too is that he maintained such a level for so long. I mean, it's hard to tell. Some of the early stuff you can tell, and some of the late stuff he started to write short. When you get into the 80s and 90s, things start to thin out a little. Right. There's this wide bulk of the middle where it's hard to tell. I mean, he just kept hitting a high note again and again and again. The way he used language just, yeah. You know, you mentioned something. It reminds me of a line Hitchens has somewhere where he says, you know, that's what being a writer is. It's always testing you against people who are better, testing yourself against people who are better than you, and always having the risk saying, why do I bother? And so sometimes when I read Wodehouse and I just read some of his sentences, I'm like, man, why do I bother? You know, this guy.
Right.
It's like,
yeah, I think I'm trying to think of who it was that he made that comparison with. We're talking about Christopher Hitchens, which we might get into talking a bit more about him later, and the importance of reading people that you disagree with. But I think in that particular instance, the Hitch was referring to, or making a comparison rather between, I think it was George Orwell, who he praised as being a very clear thinker, and not necessarily a grand stylist. I mean, Orwell himself, of course, famously said that good writing is like a window pane. It's just, that's it, just clear, what you see is what you get, kind of straightforward ideas. And obviously he had the weight of ideas to carry him through. But then Hitchens contrasted him to somebody like, say, Marcel Proust, who you open up one of those tomes and there's like a 3-page sentence with 48 semicolons and, you know, subordinated clauses. And you just think, oh my goodness, why bother? Why bother when there's guys like this doing that?
Right.
You get a bit depressing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you had some big idea guys, big thinkers, and I thought maybe we could start with the general and start with your philosophers and your macro thinkers, and then maybe we can whittle it down into some of your go-to specific investors, specific writers for investing, rather. But why don't you start us off, mate?
Right. So the general philosophers, I mean, I could talk about a handful or more of people for sure, but I think if I have a favorite, I'll mention a few favorites, and two of them are kind of difficult, but one of them is very good books to read. So anyway, I'll start. The first one I think of is Alfred Korzybski, not very well known. He was born in 1879, died in 1950. He created the discipline called general semantics, which is kind of like, think of it as a framework for critical thinking. And so he wrote a number of big books. And in fact, my book, How Do You Know, is applies his framework to investing. So that tells you how important it is to me. I've used a lot of his stuff. So the problem with him, again, is it's hard to recommend a specific book because they're difficult, but I got one here that's very easy to read, and it's called General Semantics Seminar 1937, Olivet College Lectures. And this is pretty easy to read. It's not very long, only 200 pages, and you get a pretty good sense for what his project is all about. But if I had to describe it, I'd say like Korzybski's big into how our language influences how we think, and how our language can misrepresent what they're intended to describe. So a famous phrase of his is, the map is not the territory. That's Korzybski's. And that's his most famous phrase. Everybody has ever heard it, maybe not heard of Korzybski, but they know that. Another thing that one of his innovations is he was one of the first to use air quotes like this. So, problematic words. So, if you say, well, capitalism, we put quotes because what does it mean, right? To different people, it means different things. It's not something like an animal in the backyard we go point to. There's capitalism. It's an idea. It's a funny looking animal. Yeah, it's very vague. And there's a lot of words like that. We talk about democracy or freedom. And so those are the kinds of things. And he's really influenced me a lot that way. Another guy I like a great deal is Buckminster Fuller. And again, similar. His books can be technical and difficult, but for him, it's more his life too, the way he lived his life. He was big into thinking for yourself and experimenting. Again, put some context that Bucky he liked to be called Bucky. He was born in 1895, died in 1983, did a lot of things. He was an inventor, a mathematician, a poet, just did a lot of different things. He's most famous for the geodesic dome It's kind of, he popularized that. One of his pet phrases that I love is dare to be naive. So he had this idea that no matter what people think, and even if you have all these impressive thinkers arrayed, don't think that there isn't something yet to be learned or something to change. And so I really take a lot from him. And again, his books are hard, but there's one anthology that I like a lot, and I would recommend, if you want to start with Buckminster Fuller, you can start with Anthology for the New Millennium. And this has selections from all of his different works, and each piece has a nice introduction written by somebody. So it kind of puts it in context, and that way you can, kind of see what you like about Bucky, and you can pursue whatever direction you want. Because he wrote about architecture. There's some of his stuff, it's about designing cars, houses. Then he would write about, you have 2 big fat books on geometry. I mean, he was really one of those original kind of American genius types that I really find inspiring.
Yeah,
the third guy I mentioned,
man,
he's kind of like a modern Renaissance man. He was a great admirer of Einstein's as well. In fact, I wrote a paper recently comparing the ideas of Korzybski and Buckminster Fuller, and that will be published this year, and etc. It's an academic journal, but something
very
I do
nice.
a little bit.
Look out for that, for sure.
Something I do a little bit on the side as well. But then the other philosopher that I really like, big picture guy, wrote beautifully, spoke beautifully, is Alan Watts.
Okay.
And there's a lot of, I probably have close to 40 of his books. He probably published, they're thin. A lot of them are thin. He probably published close to 20 in his lifetime. And then there's been a bunch of stuff come out after he's died. Transcripts of his talks. You can find him on YouTube and listen to him. He's a great talker. He's one of these guys. His voice is just, he's got a great voice, and he seems to be one of those guys who speaks in complete sentences. You can just put it down in a page and publish it.
It's a lost art, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. He's great at that. I really admire that skill. So he also wrote a memoir. It's very good. I have a collection of his letters, some of his academic work. But the first book I wrote was called The Book by Alan Watts. And so they've republished it. This is an old cover, so your cover will look different. But it's called Alan Watts. It's called The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are by Alan Watts. And for me, Alan Watts was kind of my entree into Eastern philosophy. That's what he's known for. He writes about Zen and Taoism and Vedanta and those kinds of things. But he has his own spin on those things as well. But I like the way he kind of changes your perspectives on a lot of different things. And he writes so well. So he has some really nice metaphors. So I'll give you one that I remember. He talks about cause and effect. Like we always talk about, something happens, something follows it. And we think in terms of cause and effect. But he says, if you think about it, our view of the universe might be much more limited than that. And so he uses the example, like if you were looking through a peephole and you saw a cat head walk by, and then later you saw the tail follow, and then you see the cat head walk back the other way and the tail follow, you might actually say that one caused the other. But, it's all really just one cat. It's just kind of one event. And so I often think about that, about how, even when I'm thinking about economics and politics and other things, about how everything is really connected, and they may be connected in ways we don't really understand or perceive. And so it makes me very cautious of simple cause and effect, or this happened and this happened. And that's just one small example. But even when he talks about people, he thinks of them as, he says people are like whirlpools or like flames. They're patterns. I like that idea too, because there's not like there's a self, there's a Joel Bowman that's it, that's Joel. Right. It's more like you're a pattern that has gone on over time, kind of change, but there's a signature that makes you Joel, but there's lots of things that change.
Including every single cell in one's body over the course of one's lifetime. So then, what we get into some questions about what is the self and so forth. But I love that. I didn't want to interrupt your flow there, but going back to Bucky Fuller, I loved that quote about daring to be naive. And I think part of that, that speaks a lot to reading. And I have a 5-year-old girl, and I tell her this a lot when, she's at the age where everything is a question, always asking, but why, Daddy? But why is this? But why is that? And, of course, that that forces, or rather invites her parents to examine what we think we know. And then sometimes we think, oh, okay, actually, I'm not quite sure about why that is so. I've always just kind of taken it for granted. But I always think about the ways, or at least my daughter is teaching me to think about the ways in which we think we know things. And so at the beginning, we think, okay, she's at the age she's learning, the alphabet and small words and things, sight words. And so we think, okay, we learn that there is such a thing called an alphabet to start with.
Yeah.
You think, okay, we've got 26 letters. And then you think, okay, well, I get to the end of this 26 letters and then I'm going to know the alphabet. And then dad comes along and says, well, there are these things called words, and they are combinations of letters. And then all of a sudden your field of potential knowledge is blown out to the entire dictionary. And then you think you've got a pretty good grasp on a vocabulary and certain jargonish, vernacular. And then someone comes along and says, oh, well, that's just one language. There are many on the planet, and they form sentences and concepts and ideas. And so I kind of feel like that with reading and just listening to you, highlight in particular 3 real polymaths there, that whenever you get into, one book, it's pretty common, especially when these kinds of thinkers are concerned, that they will lead you onto other books.
Definitely.
And I know over the years, just having read your columns through the years, that you'll invariably mention, at the end of an issue or at the end of an alert, hey, there's, these are a few ideas, tidbits that you just have kind of swirling around because you're swimming in your library all the time. So
yeah,
it's I feel like it's rather than just one static thing, one static course or syllabus. It's an ongoing project that hopefully will last our whole lives.
That's right. And some of these books, I like to call them doorway books because they're just that way. It's like you read that book and it's a doorway and a whole bunch of other things that then sometimes, things you had no idea about. So you just find new thinkers, new ideas, things you weren't aware of. Those are very valuable, and just keep going and going and going.
And oftentimes you find, some of our favorite writers. I mean, I know we have a bunch of mutual favorite writers, but those guys read really widely as well, and very different disciplines and different interests. And one of the books that was included in that Henry Miller shelf that you gifted me those years ago was a book that he wrote called The Books of My Life. And I was just going through his
terrific book.
hundreds and hundreds of authors to whom he paid homage, and he was very open about his purloining certain phrases and ideas and ways of thinking.
And this is interesting too, because with reading, like you said, people partition it off and they only want to read fiction or nonfiction or this or that. And one of the things I take from Bucky as well, he would talk a lot about this, is there are no such divisions like that in nature. He goes, nature doesn't have a biology department, a physics department. And, when nature wants to make a flower, doesn't consult with the latest biological theories. And he also had something. Exactly. He used to love this. He used to say, like, nature doesn't use pi. Pi, which is goes on repeating infinitely, and so he was always about, what is the world like? We're the ones who divide it up and chop it up and put knowledge in all these little buckets. And a lot of these kind of thinkers, that we're mentioning, they don't really respect those boundaries. They just go wherever they're.
That's right. I was thinking, as you're saying that nature not knowing any boundaries, it recalls to mind the Harari book, Sapiens, where he talks about imagined circumstances, not imaginary borders, for example, but imagined borders. It's not that a political boundary doesn't exist, but it's that we've imagined it into existence. So yes, you still have to deal with the real world consequences of not respecting that border if you just, kind of careen through the boarding gate without getting your passport presented. But these are things that we've kind of transposed onto our reality. And then I always find it interesting that it's difficult for certain imagined things, such as borders, for us to unimagine those things, for us to imagine a world, previous to those realities that we've kind of foisted upon it. And I think it might have been Harry Brown who made the observation that, if we sent our children off to school at such a young age that's where they learned to walk, for some people, it would be very, very difficult to imagine civilization ever being able to get, up off its all fours without the aid of public education.
Oh, that's right.
So trying to unimagine those things is an interesting.
Oh, of course. And, there's different things. I like the idea of, looking at the planet from space. You don't see any borders. You don't see any, it's a clear way of seeing that all these nations and ideas of different peoples and it's our imagination. It's our creation,
Right. And they may, some of those things may serve, that looking back with, in retrospect, we can have a look at some of those things and say, okay, that particular institution may have served a role to get us from point A to point B. It might have sort of catalyzed some kind of advancement in the whole human project. But I think we hang on to a lot of those things as kind of vestigial societal organs.
Right.
Maybe we might have needed, but maybe we don't need, given what we've got today. Just one last thing on the on that education thing. I guess I'm thinking about my daughter's education a bit today, so I'm on that bent. But I think it was George Bernard Shaw was debating with, I want to say Bertrand Russell, but someone will pick me up on this if I'm incorrect. But they were having a debate about the institution of public education in the UK and whether or not it was necessary. And I think it was Russell. No, it was G.K. Chesterton, pardon me, who came out and said, accused his opponent of idiocy in the following manner. His opponent was arguing for public education, and Chesterton came out and said, "You're like the idiot who wanders out into the rain with an umbrella to water the plants." We will take care of ourselves. We do have these resources, and we don't need to superficialize them into existence. We will take care of one another.
Yeah, people will. That's right. Yeah, well said.
All right, mate. So who have we got next? We've moved on from some pretty big thinkers. Good recommendations.
Yeah. So, we both love to travel. It's something I haven't done. I haven't done really at all in 2020.
Don't mention the T word. Yeah,
I know, but I think it's something that certainly impacts us both. And so, I like to think about certain travel writers that have influenced me. So I always think of Anthony Bourdain, but not necessarily. He wrote a few books that are definitely good, but most of his work is because it's on television, and he inspired me in a lot of different ways that way. And in fact, I have been called the Anthony Bourdain of finance at least a couple of times, which I consider a great honor.
Very good.
But another guy I'll take off my shelf here because I have quite a bit of his material, and is actually something that Bourdain introduced me to. He wrote the introduction to one of his books, and this guy named Ludwig Bemelmans.
Ooh, okay. New name. I'll get my pen out.
Bemelmans is a guy, if people know him at all, he's the guy who wrote the children's stories, the Madeline stories.
Oh, okay. Madeline in Paris, Madeline in
That's right. Yep, he wrote those. But what a lot of people don't know is that he also wrote for adults, and he would write in books like Holiday and The New Yorker and Vanity Fair, these other kind of magazines, and he wrote books where he collected a number of his short stories. Some of it's autobiographical, some of it's fiction. He wrote maybe 6 or 7 novels. I have all his novels. I have almost all of his short story collections, and he was also an illustrator, painter. So I have a couple of oversized folios of his artwork. I like his art. We have a Bemelmans painting sitting in our kitchen, actually. Wow. He used to paint covers for the New Yorker. And so a lot of what he writes about is travel, because that's what he did. He traveled all over the place, but a lot of his stories and paintings take place in restaurants and bars and hotel lobbies. And so I really like that. It's just as a theme. I remember New York Historical Society put on an exhibition of his art. I think it was in 2014, and I made the pilgrimage to see that. And I bought one of the little books that they had sold there, and it was like $20. And I see on Amazon now it's worth like $300.
There you go.
So a nice investment there by accident.
Yeah.
But like I say, he wrote a lot about, he would travel all over. One of his books is called Italian Holiday, and he visits the Italian Riviera and visits towns like Portofino, and he also visits Rome and Pisa. another of his books is called The Donkey Inside, where he visits Ecuador and he spends a lot of time on foot riding a donkey and visiting all these little towns. And but mostly he traveled all through France and Germany, Austria. He was actually born in the Austrian Tyrol in 1898, and he died in 62 or 63, I think. Most of his books are very light, so they're very light stories, almost Wodehouse-esque. Or another writer who reminds me of is Damon Runyon. Damon Runyon would write these short stories, and he creates this little fictionalized world that's not quite realistic, but kind of realistic. It's kind of, and so, yeah, Bemelmans writes. He writes about cooks, particularly with a special kind of poetry. Fat fingers buttering pots and sitting on carrots, feeding them into the carrot knife. And he was a bon vivant himself. He loved his cigars and his Virginia hams and shepherd's pie and wines, and so he wrote a lot about food and waiters and cooks. So this is this kind of thing. And most of his books are very happy and light. There's one book that's somber. It was called The Best of Times, where he went to Europe in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And he kind of visits a lot of his old haunts in Paris and also in Regensburg, Germany, where he grew up. And of course, the places are in rubble and shambles, and the restaurants are all shallow, of the shadows of their former selves. So that's a little bit of a depressing book. But in fact, I remember he says, I set out to write a happy book, but he found otherwise. But most of his books are very light and cheerful. And in fact, he's been called the professor of happiness. And so I have a little corner where it's a lot of his stuff in Woodhouse, and I call that happiness corner. If I'm in a bad mood, I go wander over there, and those guys make me happy again.
Yeah. It's funny, just even wandering around a man's library. You can wander around different emotional states. But
that's definitely true with me. I think so. So I picked out a couple. I mean, a lot of his books are not in print. Again, I don't know why I have these affinities for these authors that then go out of style, but some of them are. And so there's two collections by Overlook Press that I particularly think are good to start. One is called Hotel Bemelmans. This is the one that Bourdain wrote the foreword for. And then there's this one, When You Lunch with the Emperor. So you can see it. His art is, of course, in all of his stories, and that's what's nice too. You have these little sketches of his and his artwork with his stories, so it really creates certain ambiance to his stories. But these are all just like stories that have been pulled from his books, and you get a sense for his stories and whether you like them or not. But I think a lot about Bemelmans especially when I travel, and because he had a way of just kind of observing and enjoying where he was and enjoying kind of the good things in life. So
it's interesting first of all, just that it's not unusual. I think I was thinking of like Belloc or Roaldale or some of these other guys who wrote both for children and but more famously for children, and then wrote for adults, but had these really kind of hyper imaginative episodes. You imagine them kind of sitting down at their keyboard. I imagine Roaldale, as illustrated by Quentin Blake, of course, sitting down, it's stick figure banging out the Twits or Witches or George's Mother's Medicine, all those like kid classics. But you do find a lot of times that those writers have incorporated their own little spots around the world and brought those experiences into their narratives. And I was thinking, I reread Kitchen Confidential a couple, maybe a year ago, and at the end of that book he recommends a couple of other authors, and one of them was I just read George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris.
That's London. Right. That's where I got that. He recommends Zola, The Belly of Paris.
Yes.
I read that. I read that because of Bourdain and Liebling. Liebling, who wrote a book about Paris. I forget what it was called.
These little wormholes you get into. You get one author, and then you find yourself all of a sudden 10 books later. And
another one was Nicholas Freeling was another one of the books he mentioned. Bourdain mentioned. So you're right. Suddenly you're in this little subgenre of traveling gourmands,
Traveling, yeah. A little gormandizing around Europe, or yeah,
writing and out there drinking and eating. I mean, and that's interesting about Bemelmans too, is that people used to say he could order beautifully in 3 languages, French, German, and English.
Yeah, that's a compliment.
Yeah, he spoke all 3, and I do, what I admire about Bemelmans too is he could, in a way, incorporate his art and into the story, so he could do both. I mean, that's a real skill. I imagine, being able to write a short story and then also provide 3 or 4 little paintings or sketches to go with it. That's pretty nice. That's a nice skill.
Sure.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, Bourdain was the doorway guy here that introduced me to Bemelmans. I would never have guessed or found out that Bemelmans wrote for adults if I didn't come across Bourdain.
Thanks again to Bourdain. I'm thinking of the author who wrote, who's an American author, another one of these larger than life characters. He wrote, Legends of the Fall, John.
Oh, yes. Jim Harrison.
Jim Harrison.
Yeah, that's another guy in that same kind of subgenre. I've read some books of his.
Yeah, I'm thinking of
in fact, when Bourdain had his show, No Reservations, there's one where he goes to Montana and hangs out with Jim Harrison.
Oh, that's a
classic. If you want to find that, yeah, Google Anthony Bourdain, Jim Harrison, No Reservations, and watch that episode.
Oh, for sure.
It's pretty cool.
Wow, what a treat. Yeah, I remember there was one story of Harrison's where he, I think he was quite the oyster aficionado, and he flew over to, I guess it would have been Normandy or Brittany, but maybe Cancale, and they had, I don't know, some harvest in that particular year was a particularly good wine that he was drinking, and he flew out from his very, very deserted and isolated existence in the middle of Montana out to France so he could sit down and indulge in what he called the dozen, which is 12 dozen oysters. Sat down and washed it down with a couple of
he was a great eater, also a good cook.
And a good
yeah.
Another man of many skills. All right,
definitely.
And so this do we have more on the traveling theme, or?
I think that I mean there's several others. I mean, I think those are my favorites. Bourdain, Bemelmans. Yeah.
I know you've.
Well, Henry Miller wrote some great stuff. Of course, his book on Greece in particular, I really love.
Yeah, Colossus and Marusi. That's a big one. I remember you mentioning to me years ago Orwell's Travels Through Burma as being something you were.
Yes, I read that. I read that while I was in Burma, which is now Myanmar. So
isn't that just another treat altogether? You're
Absolutely.
in India reading Ian Forrester or whomever.
Absolutely, I do that all the time.
The perspective.
I do that all the time. Wherever I go, I try to read some things of where I'm going to be. Find something. Sometimes there's not always places, but like Bemelmans, a lot of his stories too happen in New York City. There's actually at the Carlisle Hotel. There's a place called the Bemelmans Bar where he did the murals all on of the whole bar, and so I made a pilgrimage there, of course, to see that. And but yeah, you're right. I mean, where you travel, and then if you have some of these guys there's some cities which there's plenty about, Paris, New York, of course, but
right.
It's also interesting if you can get off the beaten path a little. I mean, India, Burma is a good one with Orwell. I'm trying to think of some others, but I know that was something I routinely did when I would travel to some place. I try hard to find some kind of travel book of somebody who'd written about going through there.
Yeah.
Even could be 100 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's just to give you the color.
Yeah. Or even places where those writers frequented. You can go to. There's a few of Hemingway's bars, or at least bars that claim Hemingway's patronage in around Havana. For example,
absolutely.
You can go and have a whatever he drank, or probably not much that he probably didn't drink. But yeah, there you go, Cuba Libres or whatnot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good thing to do.
And so from broadening one's perspective, just geographically, how do you find? I mean, I've written emails to you. I say to people sometimes, "Oh yeah, I can write to Mayor from the weirdest places," and just say, "Hey, Chris, what should I be on the lookout for here?" I remember one time in Morocco, my wife and I were hanging out in Marrakesh, going to some hammams and doing some camping and whatnot. And I thought I should write to Mayer and just ask what's up with Morocco. Oh, you've got to check out. So for the phosphate industry, that's a big.
Yeah.
You were right onto it.
Right. And sometimes that happens with like even small time. I remember one time I went to Columbus, Ohio, and I was like, oh, well, I'm there. I should check out the Thurber Museum. He used to live there. And so I wind up going to like James Thurber's house, you know. I've even got right here a little picture of his desk, you know.
Right.
So that's definitely something that I do. Is if I go to a certain town, I'm like, oh yeah, who's here that I want to check out or see or make a little pilgrimage to their spot, you know.
So as a roving investor, because you've got, you know, kind of a big world when it comes to the ideas that you're pulling from and that you're filtering down into what you decide is a good idea or an investable asset or whatever.
Right.
Is there kind of a nexus between the travel that you've done, the books that you've read, and the ideas that they have yielded for you over the years?
Oh yeah, I mean that's definitely that's been the nexus. I think it's kind of my little formula there for a while. It's like travel, investing, you know, intersect there, and then try to bring in some sort of literary flavor to the whole thing. But yeah, I definitely enjoy doing that. And even now, I mean, I can't help myself. For example, I'm doing some research on a variety. It's about 3 or 4 Swedish companies. And strangely enough, this is
Got to go to Sweden.
Yeah, it's like, that's what I'm saying. And strangely enough, that's one place I haven't been. It's a little hollow spot there in the map, which is weird, but I would love to go there. But of course, I find myself suddenly like reading a little more of different history of Sweden and I'm sure I'll find something eventually, you know, that I'll want to read, and then I'll go there and I'll have the book in hand.
Yeah, it's such a richer experience.
Of course. And I'll have some sites and things that I'll want to check out. So that's definitely a marriage between all those things.
Yeah. And so moving along to, I guess, what I feel like we could probably ramble down literary rabbit holes all day, but when it comes to, I was thinking earlier when we're talking about the evolution of someone's bookshelf and not being a slave to, you know, this kind of
set ideas.
Yeah, I was wondering with regards to investing in particular, it'd probably be unfair to ask, at least unfair to the authors, if you had certain investors that you were enamored with when you were younger, but then kind of grew out of those ideas. So I'll ask the question in reverse. Are there books or investors / authors that you picked them up when you were younger and thought, oh, okay, maybe, but then as the years went on and the wisdom of time descended upon you, you thought, oh wow, that's actually a much more important lesson than I give credit for.
Yeah. That's definitely true. Yeah, I mean, there definitely been a number of authors that were big to me when I was younger. I don't really pay much attention to now or don't read as much now, but the reverse is also true. So that was one of the guys I was gonna mention to you, actually. So this guy named Martin Sosnoff, who was a money manager in the 60s, and he retired recently, a few years ago. And now he's pushing 90. But his books were very kind of, I don't know, call them experiential. Like he would write a lot about just the experiences of it and his emotions. And he wasn't like necessarily so analytical, but he had a way also of, he had good conceptual power of just kind of reducing money management and investing to kind of little essentials. And he's one of the guys who got me into the whole idea about owner operators. And I remember one of his lines was, entrepreneurial instinct equates with insider ownership. That was something that I read early on and has stuck with me forever. Yeah. So he writes about that a lot. He is another guy, it's become called Sosnoff's law, which is that your return varies inversely with the thickness of your research file. Which is another way of his, getting down to the essentials and the investing thesis. The more you work on it, the thicker it's got to be. Probably it's not going to be a very good idea. The best ideas are usually very simple, and very compelling. So that's something, another takeaway. There's a lot of different takeaways, and he's a very good writer. He writes vividly with metaphors, and he can be very self-deprecating. Some of his early books, he writes about himself sometimes in unflattering ways, So when I was younger, I didn't appreciate all that as much because I was more interested in, give me the secrets. How do I do? What do I do? How do I do?
Right.
But, as the years have gone by and as I get older, I much more appreciate, the black and blue nature of all his experiences and the way he shares things that he screwed up and all those other things that maybe a younger analyst isn't so attuned to. But I have scars on my back too now. So
I remember a mutual friend of ours whose name I won't mention, but he a fellow that we both hung out with in Dubai and Austria and various other places. I remember him telling me one night over some libations and probably some hookah, and I remember him telling me that one of the best lessons that he ever learned in investing was one of his mentors took him to a casino and said, "I want you to bring along a meaningful amount of money, something that will sting if you lose it." And took him along to a casino and said, "We're not getting up from whatever table it was, the craps table or whatever, until you lose everything." And then it was a pretty expensive lesson, but he went along and did that. And he said, "Okay, so now it's real. Now it's visceral. Now you can internalize the emotions, that kind of roller coaster that you go through, and all those kind of things where you win a little bit more and you want to get out, but you double down and you go through the whole theater of making all those wrong impulse decisions. And sometimes it's only by making those mistakes that you can start recognizing the little red flags when you see them in the future, and hopefully you're dealing with larger amounts of capital and things like that. But then you can recognize those in advance if you do your homework.
Definitely. And so with Sosnoff, there's two books in particular that I like. His first book came out in 1975. It's called Humble on Wall Street. And then the other one came out in the 80s. I want to say maybe it was 86. It's called Silent Investor, Silent Loser. So these are the two right here. Again, out of print.
Oh, yeah.
You got to get them used. This is my used copies. And they're both, heavily annotated.
Plenty of marginalia.
It's one of these things where it's like falls open because it's been, opened and closed so many times, but he's a very good writer. And the other thing he does is, he has, I feel like I want to read something out of it, but maybe I won't do that. But he also has this interest in art. So he's an art collector, and he has a nice way of tying in his interest in art to investing, kind of the similar worlds. I remember one time he writes about how, talking about the value of companies and how you can't necessarily always explain them. And he'll say, it's just like there are certain paintings in the past that had a huge value. Why? Is because, two princes wanted the same painting. That's all it took. And it reminds you that's how investing works too. Why is something trading where it is as well? It's just where people are willing to pay for it right now. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about, that's what it's worth. So he has a lot of ways where he ties in art, and he's written other books. So he's written 3 other books, and I think they're all in print. So, but I think my favorites are the early ones. So I actually met him too. I reached out to him. This was I think around 2015, and he's just what I expect. He's just like his books. He's this gruff New Yorker from the Bronx, very blunt talker, but I guess he could clearly detect that, I wasn't just some guy who just, wanted to talk to him. I had read his books, and it was, I guess he picked up on the clear affinity I had for what he was saying. So he met with me, and then we got along pretty well. I was in his office for over an hour. He was just telling me stories and talking about things. So that was nice sometimes when you meet people and they are who you expect them, because a lot of times you don't necessarily want to meet them because they're not at all who you thought they were.
Right, exactly.
I have some examples that way, which I will not mention.
Right, there you go.
But Sosnoff was one of those I was pleased about.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation that he brings, where he uses art to bring in, essentially it would be a Misesian kind of subjective value theory with regards to price. Again, we go back to the beginning of the conversation. Price being something that we that we transpose upon a transaction, but it's not set in cement, and something that is worth a certain price today, given a different set of circumstances, given a different time, a different era, will be worth something, completely different. I always think about people, what would you be willing to spend on a bottle of water, depending if you're, standing under Niagara Falls or like in the middle of the desert? I mean, obviously your circumstances are going to change.
Right. I love that example.
utility.
In fact, I've used that example before in a speech where I'll ask people, well, what's more valuable? A diamond? What would you rather have? I think I used the example of a gold bar or a glass of water. Of course, everyone says the gold bar is more valuable, but then I said, well, what if we were in a desert, and you hadn't had anything to drink for 2 days? Which would you rather?
changes
It suddenly changes it.
quickly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. So he's one I definitely like. I mean, there are others, but I feel like I have to mention Thomas Phelps, who wrote 100 to 1 in the stock market.
Yep.
Of course, and that because this is
your
I inspired by him to update this book. So this there's a new cover. This is the original. It's been republished, and this one I actually got, interestingly enough, is signed by him too.
All right. Was that a personal signature, or that was just
No, it was one of these where I bought it used, and it just happened to have an inscription. It just says his name and it dates it. It's 1983, and he wrote the book in 72. This is a 72 hardcover. So this book is as old as I am. There he is, looking at his all square head.
Yeah.
Well, he must have been a nice guy. I don't know. So I love him because he's another guy who, because I like to write. I'm attracted to the guys who are also good writers who can, and he's a good writer. He has a lot of interesting metaphors. I mean, some of the things I remember, one chapter he's talking about fraud, and he'll say, why you as an investor, you have to be, careful about these things, and then you won't get defrauded. And he uses an example. He says, if not for thieves, there would not be locks. Basically, he says that. Another line he uses somewhere is he says, where there are no antelopes, there are no lions. So, he has a way with metaphors. He's very Buffett-esque that way. So, but, this is another book that I think I first read it in 2011. And so not when I was, a later book, but it's one whose my appreciation for it has increased over time. I think he's got a lot of good wisdom in here. And his book, he studies all the stocks that went up at least 100 to 1 from 1932 to 1972. And then I picked up the baton and updated it to 2014.
Yep.
So, some of it's a little dated, but, I think in the main, there's a lot of good wisdom in here. And again, my copy has lots of highlighting here about different passages that I like. He's pretty good. So he's another one I definitely would recommend.
I like that you mentioned these people's literary acumen as well, because it really is an art to be able to convey something that to one person is just sort of a bunch of dry equations and analytical heavy lifting, but to put it in the human context and to convey the fact that really this, in some ways, investing is kind of like a mirror of humanity. We have these big manias, and we have bull markets, we have disappointments, we have all these emotions that go into it, but there's a lot more than just sums and equations. And I think that those writers in particular, they'll bring that out.
Yeah, it's like another way to tell the human story. You tell it through politics, you can tell it through war, you can tell it through markets and investing. And I think that is the art. I used to say when I wrote my newsletter, I would think that the real art in writing a newsletter is to write something that a professional will read and appreciate, because the basic insights are good, but one where a non-professional, just anybody could pick up and also enjoy. So it's, written well enough to just capture anybody's attention, but also still has a real insight in there that even somebody who's a professional will go. So these guys are like that. I think these are guys, you can read it on one level and just enjoy it for the pleasure of reading it. And, like I say, they're good writers. And then you read on another level where they're actually, making some very profound points about investing and human psychology. So definitely, it's a hard thing to master.
Yeah. So there are some. I mean, I'm thinking of people who are perhaps starting out a library, and maybe it's a library, a financial library with investing in mind, or maybe just more broadly speaking. But are there some basic building blocks that if heaven forbid your library became the Library of Alexander burnt to the ground, what do you start with? You say, okay, I've got it, can't do without these. Just
that's funny you mention that, because I've had that thought experiment before. Yeah. Because a lot of what I have, of course, is inertia, and I think, well, if I didn't already have it, would I buy it again? I think about that sometimes, and I have had that thought experiment. I said, well, what if it all was gone and I had to start over? What would I buy again?
What are the keystones?
Yeah. And it's a hard question, because part of me says I would just buy just as I go again. Where I wouldn't go at it with any particular plan. I would just continue to read as I was reading and just let it build from there. And of course, there would be some things I would acquire again when I wanted to look at them. But, when I think about the things that some of the keystones. So, I mean, we've mentioned a number of them. So I feel like I would have to get my Korzybski and Bucky back, and get some of my Bemelmans back, and Bourdain, and I'd have to get my Sosnoff back somehow, my 100 to 1. But a lot of those books, some of the philosophy books I really enjoy, I would probably get again. I'd probably get my Seneca again and my Epictetus. And
we didn't even touch on the classics.
We didn't even touch on those.
That's a whole.
That's another whole session. Yeah, my Henry David Thoreau. I mean, that's another one that's kind of inspirational. I like. I'm sure there are certain others. Yeah, I mean, I'd probably get a lot of Alan Watts again. Woodhouse. I have quite a bit of stuff that I've had around a long time, like Mencken and Albert J. Nock.
Yep.
Those are guys I enjoy still, even to this day. It's interesting that too. It's one thing that changes is that, when I'm younger, I was much more into the ideological,
When I mean the state, I'm just thinking with
like the much more hardcore, ideological bang, bang, bang. But then as you get older, you get more interested in the guys who are a little more, let's say, flexible and open in their thinking. So I still Mencken and Nock both still hang around, because I think they were that way. They weren't ideologically committed. They didn't go around reciting chapter and verse that, so-and-so said this. They reacted to things as they happened. And Nock was another great traveler. He wrote a very nice book where he traveled through France. And I read that. I brought that with me last time I was hanging out with Bill at his chateau. And that was a nice book to read then. So that's a great question. That's those are the kind of things I would think about replacing.
Yeah, I feel like I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that I've just moved into this new apartment, and my books are always the last thing that I unpack. Whenever I get into a new place, I get all the furniture out, get the bed, hook the fridge up, all that kind of stuff. But I like to take my time unpacking my books, because depending on how long you've been in the last place,
right,
and no matter how pedantic, and I'm fairly fastidious with where I kind of catalog things and archive things, but things get messy and they get out of order, and eventually just kind of let it have a life of its own. But I always get into a new place, and it's maybe a week or two when I start looking at places around the apartment where I'm going to put the shelves, where I'm going to put this stuff, and then I like to open a nice bottle of wine and put some music on, and
there you go.
Then just unwrap them, and they're like old friends. It's like
right. Exactly right.
With a bunch of new friends.
That's one of the pleasures of having a library. Sometimes at night I'll do exactly what you say, and just kind of wander on my own shelves and pick out things and read little bits of things again. And that's one of the nice things about having them. I mean, other guiding principle in replacing, I think, would be wit and humor. Those are two things I greatly admire. And so a lot of the guys I mentioned to you actually are among the wittiest people I have in my library, and they would be the ones I replace. Those are the ones you go back to, you laugh and you get inspired. So speaking of wit,
oh right,
it would be a good segue.
So yeah, one of the great sardonic wits, alas, no longer with us, and actually one of someone that whenever I get an email from you around, I think it's mid-December, isn't it?
Right.
Around mid-December.
December 15th, I think.
I think
but something
you must have it on your calendar, but it was the year that Mr. Christopher Hitchens passed away.
Right.
And or the date that he did. And I remember.
Well, every time it happens, somebody on Twitter says something too. So it's always,
right.
It always gets recognized somehow. And then I think of you because
we were in Nicaragua. When would that have been? 2012 or something like that?
No, it was 2011. It was December. It was because we were talking about it the day before. Yeah. Well, it was the day before. It was that night. We were hanging out at our room. We had a nice house. Yeah. And I remember we were on the balcony looking at the beach, and you were telling me about this guy Hitchens and saying, I got to watch these, YouTube things. And we watched a bunch of them. We were laughing,
We went through all the Hitch slaps, the greatest Hitch slaps.
I mean, he's so witty, this guy. This is another trait I greatly admire. I mean, he just is so quick on his feet, and he's so, witty is no other word to describe it. But we were talking all about that. And then the very next day we were having breakfast and you were reading your laptop and you were like, Hitchens died. I can't believe. You're like, oh man, I'm gonna miss that dude or something you said. And I was like, yeah, we were just talking about him.
Yeah.
So that's I'll never forget that, because and then when I asked you, well, what should I read? And you recommended some things. And then so ever since then, of course, I've been hooked. Now I think I have pretty much all his books, I think now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is what 10 is coming up on 10 years. But when I think back to 2011, I try and reimagine the world as it was then. And I mean, it was such a delight to, pick up the monthly copy of Vanity Fair, which he used to write for, or Slate, or these other publications that, I would be just as enthusiastic to read a copy, his monthly column that I vehemently disagreed with, as I would to read a column that I was kind of cheerleading along. And I feel like in the 10 years since he's passed, that we talked about this before, but we've become just so polarized and are almost incapable of many people are almost incapable of reading anything that doesn't confirm their already preconceived biases and things like that. And I think that's probably a pretty worrying trend, when you can't entertain two separate thoughts without having to take ownership of one or the other of them.
Yeah, we've talked about this within the context of Hitchens, because we both really, we admire his writing style and his wit, and we laugh about things he says, but we disagree with so much what he said. Yeah. I mean, especially sure. I remember, it's like stuff on foreign policy, and a lot of his heroes would not be people we would choose. I mean, I'm thinking of like, Trotsky and Marx and,
Yeah, goodness.
I mean, it's very different from us in that way, but it's also, how can you not, admire his range, his style, his wit? I mean, and he had this uncanny ability that, we've talked about, that he could just speak in sparkling prose.
Yeah.
I just feel like a lot of his speeches, or even interviews, you could just take his responses, and with some minimal editing, you'd have a pretty nice column, It's like,
yeah, he spoke in column vernacular. Essentially,
seems like
1,000-word bites of just immediately publishable prose.
The other thing that I really admire about him was his willingness to engage in debate with people. I mean, far and above anything that I would do. But and his ability to take criticism. So he'd deliver these biting criticisms, but then when they were put back to him, he was very chill about it. People would, he could even be humorous about it. I mean, he was a very enlightened figure in that way. And I can remember reading stories of him. Of course, he was famous for his debates with religious people, and he would just go alone. He would just go and debate some reverend or pastor or something. I mean, it takes a little bit of courage, and it tells you a little bit about him. Is he valued argument for argument's sake. That was the thing for him.
I remember seeing one discussion that he was having with the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse, and one of the other speakers at that particular roundtable asked him, so, could you imagine, and they were talking about theism and organized religion at that time. And somebody said to him, oh, so you imagine a world without religion. And this is one of probably the most famous, firebrand, iconoclastic atheist going in the world at the time. And his response was, oh no, I wouldn't have that. Not only do I not think it's likely, but I enjoy the fight, which I just thought was quite remarkable.
It wasn't what you, exactly. I remember that conversation.
That goes back to we don't have time to get into the classics now, but that goes back to an idea that I really like, and it's one of the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus's idea, where he talks a lot about oppositional forces, and they're it shows up in Eastern philosophy with yin and yang, and we get these lots of an enantiodroma is the basic idea in the Heraclitean terms, but there's a very famous sculpture of two wrestlers that are leaning into one another on the wrestling mat, and were it not for the fact that they're both applying equal but sort of changing pressure on one another, neither of them could stand. They'd be flat out on the mat. So there's this tension between ideas all the time, and we see it in
right.
all walks of life, and once you start paying attention to it, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to miss and to avoid. But I mean, it just is something as simple as a buy and a sell. You always have this tension on both sides that create an energy in the middle, and that's kind of the spark of life.
And that's how you I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but it's like you have to appreciate the differences, appreciate even your enemies, because that's how you define yourself. There's no up with down, there's no black without white. So you define yourself partly by oppositions to these different ideas and tensions, and they all go together. I mean, if there was, like Hitchens said, basically implied, if that side didn't exist at all, where would he be? What would be the fun?
Right. So maybe on that note, I'm cognizant of your time, but maybe on that note, you could mention perhaps somebody that you thoroughly disagree with, but that you think would be worth knowing his philosophy, if only to know where the headed, so to speak.
Well, yeah, if I gave some more thought, I might answer differently, but I'll give you the first name that comes to my head because I was reading it recently. Was Thomas Hobbes. Leviathan.
Okay. Leviathan, yeah. Nasty, brutish, and short. That's
absolutely. He has a very dim view of human nature.
Yeah, and he would be an absolute buzzkill at a dinner table.
Oh man, he seems like. Although I also read a biography of his, and apparently he was a bit that way. Actually, they say there was some club. I remember they didn't invite him because he was a buzzkill. He was like,
Hobbes guy again.
Oh God, exactly. But yeah,
he's
a believer in absolute monarchy, a very strong government, and he had this dim view of human nature. So he reaches these conclusions that very few people would agree with. But it's more interesting to read about how he gets there and how he thinks, because sometimes you're like, well, that's not a bad point. It's like, well, that's a good point, but it challenges you to think about, well, why is he wrong there?
Right. And you have to reframe, I think, those kinds of thinkers. We were talking just before about Karl Marx, for example, like those kinds of thinkers. They do tend to challenge things, not necessarily in totality, but they may have some interesting little tidbits along the way that force you to flesh out and refine your own position on things that you might not have thought very deeply about before, even if you end up vehemently disagreeing with that particular author on any given subject. It doesn't hurt to sharpen your own perspective from time to time.
Yeah, and that's why I've learned to respect the classics like this, because there's a reason why Leviathan has been such an influential book and is still in print all these years, 3 centuries more later. And it's because it's a book that's really rich in ideas, and he makes you think. He makes some arguments that make you stop and think, even if you totally disagree with them, that make you. So, I think that's the good thing about Marx. Is another really good figure that way. He's definitely somebody I would think of in that light as well. There's some things in Marx that are really make you think, worth reading. You can see why he's been, a compelling figure for a long time. I remember, I used to talk about my economics friends, Austrian friends, and I would tell them the same thing about Keynes. It was remarkable how few people had actually read him. Keynes at times is a pretty good writer, but
no slouch in the investment field.
A very good investor. He was also pretty witty. Some of his investment memoranda are very funny, laugh out loud funny.
What was his line about? When the information changes, I change my mind.
When the facts change, that's his classic. When the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do?
That's difficult to come back to, isn't it?
Yeah. He also had his last line, or his last words were apparently also, I really like. He says, "I should have had more champagne."
More champagne. Yeah.
I love that line.
I think about that frequently when raising a glass. Let's all do as Keynes.
Yeah.
Let's all do as Keynes wishes he had more time to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's a good message for people anyway.
Sure. Okay, mate. That's probably a pretty good one to end it on. I think we can I'll try and rouse up some links to all the books that you mentioned below. Obviously, some of them out of print, but people might be able to get them on Amazon.
Yeah, well, I was going to bring up this one, but
something.
There he is.
Well, arguably, yes.
That was going to be my recommended starting place for people. So.
Oh, very good. Yeah, and his.
You recommended God Is Not Great first, which I read, and that was fantastic.
Yeah,
and then I asked you again, what else should I read? You said arguably, so then I read that. And then after that, I found my way around. Those were the two. Yeah.
He's got a couple of shorter kind of compilations. One is Mortality, that he was writing when he was dying of cancer, which is remarkably humorous for a man who is
funny and very sad. I remember reading that. I was just like, man, that sucks.
Yeah, that was a bummer.
I mean, it literally just sort of dissolves at the end, and little notes and things.
Becomes fragmentary, and you're watching a mind being pulled apart right at the end. That was very difficult. And then also his Letters to a Young Contrarian, a title which he fought with his publisher because he hated, as a typical contrarian, he hated even the word contrarian because that raised his.
That's an excellent book.
His ire.
My copy of that is got a lot of highlighted passages as well. It's a very good book.
And then, of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, Mr. Mayor, your own books, which should be, of course, on every listener's bookshelf, from How to Invest Like a Deal Maker all the way through to the next chapter of the 100-bagger era. So we'll link to all those guys as well. But
all right,
mate, I really appreciate it. This is fantastic. Get to talk to one of my favorite writers and thinkers, and about one of my favorite subjects. Good books.
That's awesome. It's a lot of fun.
Hopefully we can do it in person sometime.
Cool. Definitely.
All right, mate. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bonner Private Research Podcast. You can find more conversations like this in the members-only section of our website at bonnerprivateresearch.com. If you would like to contact us, please address compliments and complaints alike to podcast@bonnerprivateresearch.com. We look forward to hearing from you either way. Until next week.